All right, Amit, thanks so much for doing this. It's been a long time. I've known you for a very long time, but we haven't seen each other in person for quite a while. But obviously, have been keeping tabs on everything that you've been doing. Why don't we start with your background? This isn't the first thing that you've been doing. You actually have quite an interesting background, I think. Why don't we start there? Tell us about your journey up to here, professionally at
Sure.
least.
Yeah. Well, first, thanks for having me here. It's always fun to talk with you, and it's been way too long.
Yeah.
So I guess really quickly, I've been an entrepreneur most of my life. I started out like fixing computers for the teachers in high school, and then dropped out of college midway through to start a .com in 1999 when that was the thing to do. And I've always been like a computer geek. After finishing college, I remember taking this road trip out west, and like the highlight of the whole trip, it was like a 2 or 3 week long trip. We saw all these sites and stuff, but the highlight was like going with my co-founder and driving by Steve Jobs' house in South Bay and just like ogling at it. And it's just a totally normal house, like, suburban 3-bedroom house or whatever, but just like in awe of like being there.
Yeah.
And yeah, after college, I helped Seth Godin start a nonprofit, learned like a decade's worth of marketing in 6 months.
Yeah.
Moved to New York City, did a bunch of organizing, hosting events, helping to create the New York City tech community. That's where we met.
Hmm.
And created Jelly with my friend Luke Crawford, which became this worldwide co-working distributed event.
Yeah.
And then it was around that time that I started Photojojo. I was super into photography most of my life. And then in New York City, especially, it's just such a photogenic city. I started this email newsletter about photography and creativity that turned into an e-commerce business, turned into the next 7 years of my life, and was probably the most fun thing I've done. So that's kind of the highlights. There's more that brings us to today, but I'll stop
Yeah.
there.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to before we jump to kind of present tense. I had forgotten about the Seth Godin thing. You mentioned, a compressed kind of education. What were maybe some of the big lessons that you took out of your time with him that kind of informed some of the future stuff that you've done? Because you have a very opinionated approach, I think,
Yeah.
to how you build stuff and how you market things.
Oh man. I learned so much from him, and I feel like I'll never be able to give him enough credit, honestly. Seth has this unique lens into seeing the world, and once you look through it, you can't forget what you've seen. And I'm still learning from him. Like just last week, I feel like I reread Free Prize Inside, and I was reminded of so many things I'd forgotten, and I was like, I'm excited to like take them back into my work.
Yeah.
But I guess first and foremost, the most important thing I learned from him was that marketing and even sales aren't dirty words. They're not bad things. And on some level, I think I'd always thought about them as evil, as these things to use to manipulate people to your gain. And I just like didn't want to be that. I didn't want to be a marketer, didn't want to be a salesperson.
Hmm.
But I think he helped me understand that in their purest sense, sales is about helping people solve their problems and improving their lives. And if
Hmm.
you're selling something to people who don't want it or need it, that's evil. But if you're making them aware of something that solves their problems or helps make their life better in some genuine way, then
Hmm.
sales is just about helping that person. And I
Hmm.
think that really shifted things for me. It helped me understand that I could talk about the stuff that I was doing, and I could do things to help people find what I was doing. And it wasn't just self-promotion. It was actually helping people if I was talking about it in the right way, being
Hmm.
respectful,
Yeah.
and talking to the right people.
It sounds like it's kind of a thin line. Like what were some of the implications, I guess, when you talk about the difference between it being, I guess, how do you figure out that you're talking to somebody who wants what you're offering and it's legitimately helpful versus, like you said, kind of the more evil side where you're trying to push something on somebody that they may or may not want. How do you think
Yeah.
about that line?
Yeah, I mean, I think step one is less talking, more listening, right? Like you gotta find out who this person is, and it starts with a person, right? Even if you're selling to thousands of people, you have to understand like one person at a time, and
Hmm.
maybe that person represents a lot of people, but you got to listen. You got to understand what their needs are, what their problems are, why they do the things they do, why their life is set up the way it is, what they care about, what they love, all that stuff. And I
Hmm.
think that gives you a lot of basis for understanding how you can help. And potentially you can help with the product or the service you've got. Potentially you can't. Maybe you can still help, but it has nothing to do with your product. It has nothing to do with selling them anything.
Yeah.
And I think that's when you're in that state of mind, then I think you're doing it right. You just want to help this person.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. You with Photojojo, you, I assume you applied a lot of these lessons. You mentioned starting with the newsletter, which is pretty interesting. And, you know, they're some of my favorite examples of, you know, pretty successful companies started off kind of either with a community aspect or something like that, where you're almost like building, I hate to use the word platform because it's a little bit of a loaded word, but, what was the thinking behind kind of starting with a newsletter, and was that all you were trying to do, and then it kind of evolved into a bigger thing, or was that kind of the plan from the beginning?
Yeah, so it was the plan from the beginning was just to do newsletter. So the rest of the stuff was kind of fortuitous. And I think our thinking at the beginning was I wanted to start small. I didn't want to raise money. I was making some money like consulting on the side, and I wanted to do something manageable and tiny. And the newsletter felt kind of anachronistic at the time. I feel like newsletters have had this like second wave recently, but this was in the trough of that, where like newsletters weren't really cool at the time.
Yeah.
But there were so many blogs and so many websites, and RSS was a big deal. And it felt like people's attention was split across so many different spheres. And so I wanted to find a way that I could write only once or twice a week and still have an impact, instead of having to post to a blog 8 times a day or whatever to like have that impact. And email was the way to do it, because people were still paying really close attention to email. Yeah. So that's why we started with that as a platform. And along the way, we added the other stuff, mostly because advertising was the only way to monetize the newsletter, and I didn't like selling ads.
Got it. That makes sense. You, from the very beginning with Photojojo and also with what you're doing now, it seems like, and again, I think this, I don't know if this ties back to some of the lessons that you learned from Seth, or if this is just, how much of this is just who you are as a personality, and kind of injecting it into your brand. But I've used Photojojo in my class as a case study around like, and I call them delighter features, but it's like throughout the product, you're using copy in a way that is, and I don't want to use the word cute, because I think it diminishes maybe, or understates what it is that you were actually doing. But the product has a personality, and it's throughout. And you would ship little dinosaurs with the first order. And I remember Flickr with like thousands of these little dinosaurs on Flickr, and the cookie smell and in the box and all of that kind of stuff. How do you think about, I guess, injecting personality and using brand? Because it seemed like it was a huge force multiplier for you from a retention perspective and word of mouth. And is that, I guess I just have a lot of, like, how do you think about that? Because is that you, and that's just, I can't help but be that way? Or is that strategic, or both? How do you think about that stuff?
Yeah, there's so many interesting things there. It's something I'm really passionate about. It's definitely something, you mentioned Seth, it's definitely something that I think he also helped spark. He talks a lot about being remarkable, and how it's one of the most important ways that you can market and sell, just like making a better product, a more interesting product. Yeah. And when you look at the web today, when you look at, apps today, there's so much sameness. Like if you go back a decade or 2 decades, there's an incredible diversity of designs, of interactions, of all sorts of like playful things. The web was really fun and quirky and weird 20 years ago. And now it's all like very, very homogenous, which is
the dribblization of design, if I guess you could call it. Right?
And it's a little sad, but it's also a huge opportunity. So it's kind of great, because if you're willing to actually go out and do something different, it's so easy to get noticed, because you don't have to be that different to stand out today. And I think, if you try to make something that looks like everyone else because you think that's what you're supposed to do, it's just forgettable, because there's so many things like it. And if you make something different that's going to please not everybody, because if you try to please everybody, you please nobody. If you try to please yourself, if you try to make something fun for yourself and your friends, you'll find that so many people are excited about that weird, quirky thing, and they want to tell friends about it. And I think that's where the ROI comes in, because I don't think we spent a single dollar on Facebook ads or Google ads or any of that stuff. We didn't pay into that like ad hegemony, monopoly,
Yep.
duopoly, whatever.
Yep.
We just made stuff that was weird and interesting and worth talking about. And that was not only cheaper to access people, it was just so much more fun to do it that way. Like if you
Yeah.
spend your life optimizing Google AdWords, your life is a spreadsheet. If you spend your life trying to find like quirky, weird design elements and ways to make people smile, then you get videos of people smiling and photos of them smiling, and they're excited to see you when they meet you. It's just a whole different world. So yeah, that's always what I've been about. It's definitely something that I want to work into Sudo, what we're doing now, even more and more.
Hmm.
I don't think we do it enough yet, but I think we're going to do it. We're going to do more of it.
Is it just, I mean, I would imagine that it's to a certain degree, it's a muscle that you just have to work with practice. But I mean, either early on or even today, are there, I don't want to use the word frameworks, but are there tools or techniques or things that you do to make that more likely to happen? Like as an example, like I used to tell my students, when you're doing like your UX audit or whatever it is, like look at every single page on the site, hold up this version of like if your product was a person, who would they be like? Would they sound like? We do that exercise, and then look at every single page on the site and ask yourself, like, how could I make that 10% cooler or weirder or whatever it is? Like, is there anything similar that you've kind of leveraged to kind of make this happen more consistently? Because you're very good at it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I think that going to the edge is the way that I try to think about it. So you don't have. It's okay when you're brainstorming. It's okay when you're just trying to be creative to think of bad ideas. And one of the most easy and like methodical ways to think of bad ideas is going to extremes. So if you're thinking about any type of problem on any vector you're thinking of, you can think about what's the most extreme on either end of the spectrum that you can go to with this, whether or not it's ridiculous, whether or not it's possible, just think about it. And as you think about it, you start to think about other extremes. And as you think about these like absurd things, usually you come up with something that actually could work, even though it's kind of extreme, or something that's like just back from the brink of being absurd, that actually would work and would get a lot of attention. So I like to do that.
Yeah, that's really cool. I think wasn't that a Godinism as well? He talked about like Hummer and Mini Cooper at the time as being like you can go the smallest, you can go the biggest. Like it almost doesn't matter what edge you choose, just pick one and go all the way.
Yeah. Just don't be in the middle.
Yeah. You seem to have a gift too around copy and voice. Are there any approaches that you use there? Because I mean, that's the cheapest way to do brand, I think, for a startup, especially is through copy, right? And to kind of give it a personality. How do you think about that?
Yeah. So I think it's similar in a lot of ways. I think you have to write for yourself. And that's true when you're writing fiction too. I think you have to write for yourself. If you're trying to write for, like B2B SaaS customers or whatever, you're going to write really boring copy because it's going to look like everyone else's copy because you're afraid. You're going to try to make it seem like as inoffensive as possible. And that's the death knell for any copy. And I think it takes courage to make something that might make people look funny at it. It might make people a little confused potentially too. It takes courage, but I think it's so much scarier to be forgotten, to be forgettable, to be ignored, than it is to, make people a little confused or upset. But yeah, just write for yourself. I think that's the easiest thing for me. And it's hard to get into, but yeah, it takes some courage to put out some stuff like that.
Yeah, that's super cool. Okay, so you did Photojojo. You ended up selling it, I believe. Took some time off, and then you got into fiction writing. How did that kind of evolve?
Yeah, so after Photojojo, I took some time off and I traveled and advised some startups and coached and did a bunch of different things and wanted to find my way to something different just because I had the opportunity. And I grew up reading science fiction. It's what got me excited to go out and invent things, to make things. And I hear that story from so many people, so many of my peers. And it kind of saddened me to see the state of science fiction today. It's just very dystopian. And I think that it's still fun to read, but it's kind of dark. Yeah,
there's a theme. Yeah, it tends to be pretty consistent. Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah. And you can't invent stuff that you can't imagine. I grew up reading science fiction that was some of it was dystopian, but some of it was very utopian, some of it was balanced.
Yep.
And if you can only read books and read stories about how dark the future is going to be, how bad technology is going to make things for us, it's hard to imagine technology making the world better.
Mm-hmm.
And that's dangerous, I think, because
Yeah.
we read this stuff, we grow up on it, and then we try to invent what we saw, good or bad. So I wanted to at least try to add another voice to that chorus, one that was less ominous and more
Yeah.
utopian, more
Yeah.
balanced. So
Yeah.
that's why I got into science fiction.
Wow. And how did you go about learning to write? I mean, not that you didn't know, obviously you knew how to write, but you know what I mean? How did you learn to
No,
write
yeah.
fiction? How did you learn yeah, like what was that process like?
I was learning how to write. I felt like I was like, all the way at the bottom again. I was used to being good at what I did, and here I was like terrible at what I did.
Yeah.
Trying to climb this rope.
Mm-hmm.
I read a lot of stuff. I wrote a lot. I read Stephen King's on writing and all the writing books that everyone tells you to read, and they all just say like, just write every day, write every day. So I just wrote every day. Probably the biggest lever for me was finding other people who were at a similar stage trying to become science fiction writers. So I eventually found my way to a group that our friend Sahil started. That's where I met my co-founder, James Yu, who's my co-founder for Sudo. He was also someone who had started some tech startups and then decided to write science fiction. But having that like weekly cadence of meetings where we were bringing work, critiquing work, and feeling accountable to each other to create every week was absolutely essential.
That's so cool. And then was that local or was that distributed?
Always distributed. We were all in different places, so it didn't really change after the pandemic started.
And is it like you're meeting on Zoom or are you sending, I got it.
Yeah, we send stories to each other. It's been on hiatus for a while. Both James and I have gotten so busy with Sudo, so we haven't been going, but we would send stories to each other a few days before the meeting. We would all individually read the stories and write up some critique. And then we'd have like a 1 hour meeting where we were going through each story and giving critique.
That's super cool. It seems really valuable. So I get that brings us to Sudo. I mean, so you're getting into fiction writing and you're doing all this stuff. What was it that got your gears moving around creating something like Sudo?
Yeah, so GPT-3 came out last year. GPT-3, for those who don't know it, it's just basically one of the largest text transformer models that's been released. It was created by this organization, OpenAI, and it inhaled the entire internet, this entirely, the large corpus of books, all this other written material. And its purpose is to basically take something and try to predict what comes next. So if you give it a paragraph, give it a page, whatever, it'll try to predict the next few sentences, paragraphs, page, whatever. So we saw this, and just because I think both James and I had seen former versions of this, and they were kind of like fun toys, but they weren't really useful. But there are folks like Robin Sloan and other authors who'd played with this stuff. Ken Liu, I think, had played with it too, as a way to accelerate their writing and just kind of deviate from their normal ways of thinking. And GPT-3 was orders of magnitude larger. So it got us very excited. And I think James was playing with it first. He just started to like build this little web app that was a text editor and would predict what you were going to write before you wrote it. And I got excited seeing that. I started playing around with it too. And I think very quickly we saw that this wasn't a toy anymore. This could actually spark your creativity and actually enhance creativity in a way that wasn't possible for this medium before. I think we forget, if we're not writers, like as a designer and as a photographer, I'm so used to using all these digital tools to enable my workflow and take all the drudgery out of, like, I don't go to the darkroom when I develop photos. It's like instantly there and I can edit them very easily, but you can't do that with writing. And so as a writer, you're like just really painstakingly working word by word to make things better. And I think there's a future coming pretty quickly where you don't have to do that, that you can have some pretty powerful assistance in those things.
Yeah. So, you started tinkering around and now, Sudo, I mean, I think it's kind of hard maybe for folks to visualize, especially like over audio or whatever it is, but walk through like, how do you use Sudo and what does it help you do?
Yeah, so there's a lot of different things it can do. One of the things it helps with is writer's block. So if you're working on a story, or it can be nonfiction too, working on an essay or whatever, and you're kind of stuck with where to go next, you can hit this button called Wormhole. And Wormhole will actually write what comes next in 4 different directions. You can hit it again, you'll get 4 more. And it's in your own style. It's in your own kind of voice. If there's any narrative arcs or character arcs you've started, it'll try to follow those. And it does a remarkable job. It's like, it's astonishing how good this is. It doesn't seem like a computer should be able to do this. And it's a great way to spark what comes next. You may use the copy that comes out. You may just use it as inspiration for where you want to go with the story next. So you can do that with prose. You can also do that with an outline. Maybe you've like sketched out the beginning of something and you want some ideas for where you can go next. It can help you with that. Maybe you struggle with description. A lot of writers say that they need help with like describing a scene or a character or whatever.
Yeah.
You can just highlight that thing, hit describe, and it'll give you ideas for how to describe that person, place, or thing using each of your 5 senses. So what it smells like, what it looks like, what it feels like, all that kind of stuff. And yeah, it does a ton of other stuff. It can actually like take a summary of a scene you've written and expand it out into a first draft. It can give you feedback on a story. It can, we're launching this new feature called Brainstorm, which I'm really excited about, where you can very freeform, just brainstorm different ideas for anything. And it's a very fun kind of playful way to come up with ideas.
Yeah. That's so cool. How, as you've, I mean, I would imagine that you're pretty heavily, if not now, it sounds like you've gotten pretty busy, but at least for a good chunk of time, you were actively using this to help you write. What have you found about the experience of kind of having this sidekick with you? You know, like kind of where do you end and it begins? And it seems like it's a very collaborative kind of process, I would think, right?
Yeah, it's not lonely. I think that's one of the big things you start to feel, especially going from like kind of building companies and building tech. It's so collaborative. And when you're writing, you're really just sitting by yourself at the keyboard. If you're stuck, you're banging your head against the desk, wishing you were not stuck. And I think one of the coolest things about this is that it feels like there's someone else in the room that you can turn to and ask for help. And that person may not have the idea, but they're going to help you get unstuck and help you get moving. So that's the biggest thing. It helps you stay in flow, and it feels like you're not alone in the process.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. What have you? I guess I think of you as a marketer, but more importantly, I think of you kind of as a product person, just because of your sensibilities. I have to think that designing a product that embeds very heavily AI would be a very new and a very different type of challenge. Like, what were some of the things that maybe you learned in the process of trying to design a product that kind of folds that stuff in such a major way?
Yeah, well, we're still learning for sure.
Yeah.
I think we've figured out only a fraction of what we need to figure out so far. Yeah. But I think that one of the challenges that comes up a lot for us is how far to go with the interface. What you see today is a pretty kind of straightforward interface. It looks like a text editor. It looks like another program that you've probably used before. Yeah. But AI enables you to do a lot of things that feel like magic. And I think to fully kind of take advantage of the power there, you probably need an interface that looks kind of alien from what you're used to. And I think that's hard because people are used to writing in text editors. They're used to writing in the specific text editor that they use. Maybe it's Google Docs, maybe it's Word, maybe it's Ulysses, whatever it is, they love it. And so getting them to switch to something else is hard. Getting them to switch to something else that looks nothing like anything they've used before is even harder. So I think that's one of the challenges. How do we ease people into working with something like this? Not only because eventually it's going to look very different. Today it looks pretty similar, but it works very different. Like the process of writing in this tool is more of like a back and forth than just you kind of spewing out words. And I think to really get the most out of it, you do have to kind of learn to use it and adjust to it. So that's a challenge, how to help people get into that. And I think we're still figuring that out.
Are there any early lessons that you've kind of picked up around like it sounds like you're trying right now to sort of gently guide people and trying to slowly change their mental models. What are some examples you can think of maybe ways where you've interjected like, hey, this is 5% different from what you're used to, but it's not so different that it freaks you out or completely confuses you?
Yeah, so I think one of the things that's helpful is that we've tried to build features that are addressing specific problems that come up over and over when we talk to writers. So like describing stuff is a specific thing that comes up a lot. So if if we can say to them, this will help you with descriptions, just select the thing that you need to describe and hit this button. It'll give you ideas on the right. Like they don't need to understand that on any of the other features. They don't need to understand anything else about it. If that works, then it's useful to them, and hopefully they'll like eventually start to use the other things. So I think that's a learning, and I think we need to dive even deeper into that. Figure out what are the specific problems that writers have, and how can we, in that first use, like get them from never having seen the tool before to understanding that this can solve a very specific problem that they already have.
Yeah, I would imagine you mentioned kind of first use, that whole like idea of like the aha moment and things like that. Like I would imagine you took onboarding pretty seriously. Anything interesting you learned there about, on designing an onboarding experience or first time UX for something like this to make it more likely that light bulb goes on for them? You mentioned like having a very specific use case is one of them. That makes a lot of sense. Anything else?
I think one of the learnings is that most people will skip the onboarding, or like a lot of people will skip the onboarding. I mean, no one wants a tour. We have this like really fun tour when you start the app, where like it gives you a little bit of writing, and it like shows you how to use things, and you actually use the tool to like go through the interview. You gotta go through the onboarding. And it's not that long. But yeah, a lot of people are just like, just give me the thing, I want to use it. So that's a learning. I don't know that we figured out what to do about it yet. I think probably we need to find ways to embed pieces of the onboarding into the product itself, even if you've already gone past the onboarding.
Makes sense. You mentioned with Photojojo, you had a very particular approach to kind of company building, and it seems like you're doing the same thing here. I mean, you raised money this time, but it sounds like they were mostly from angels, or entirely from angels who kind of are philosophically aligned, or at least understand where you're coming from and are on board with it. And you're just using word of mouth again. You're not running ads, any of that kind of stuff. It seems like there's a common thread around trying to be very, not slow, but sustainable in terms of how you think about growth. How do you think about, I mean, is that accurate? Why do you think that is a better way potentially of building a business, or at least, better for you? And then maybe, is that advice that you give to other types of founders who feel like they have a lot of pressure, either self-imposed pressure or, certainly once they raise, pressure from their investors?
Yeah. So, I think that's accurate. That is kind of the approach we're taking. And I think with Photojojo, I didn't raise any money. So that was all self-funded. Started with very little, like maybe 10,000 in the bank or something. So a lot of people don't have 10,000, but it's less than the 10 million you might raise as a VC funded startup. And I think that the reason I did it that way is that I was happy with a single or a double. Like I wanted to have a good showing at this game, but I didn't need to go big or go home. Like I didn't want to fail. And I didn't want the stakes to be so high that it was most likely I was going to fail. But if there was a very, very tiny chance I succeeded, it'd be a huge success. And I think the same is true this time. Like, I think I would love for even a bigger success story here, but a success story for me would be a company that builds a product that people love, that a lot of people use, that's a sustainable business, that's growing because the product is great, not because we're just throwing floodwaters worth of money into ads. And I think that, we were very intentional about the investors we chose. James and I actually were working on this for about a year just ourselves without taking money, because we were afraid to take money and then have the reins of a VC kind of driving us into the ground. We'd both been in startups before. We knew what that felt like. And he's got 2 young kids. I have all my interests, my writing, my surfing, all sorts of other stuff that I want to keep doing. And so we weren't sure that we could actually build a company without making huge sacrifices. And it was actually the person who organized our writing group, Sahil, who ended up being our first check into the round, who convinced us that we could actually do it this way, that we could be completely upfront about the way we want to build this company and still find the money we needed to accelerate it. So that's the path we took. We raised a smaller amount of money. We raised it entirely from angels. And we've told them all the way we want to build this company is for the long term. And now we see if we can do that. Like I was telling Nancy, my girlfriend, that I didn't want to work on this like 40 hours a week even. I wanted to have weeks that were like shorter weeks. and that was my goal. And now I'm working really long weeks, and it's because it's fun, so it's okay.
Sure.
But it's like it's easy to
Yeah.
lose sight of that too.
Yeah. I would imagine that, one of the main ways in which you can kind of minimize burn is, like you mentioned, you're not relying on paid at all. And it seems like with the Photojojo story, one of the lessons that you took out of that was you got into newsletters because, one, I mean, obviously it's like high signal, low noise, but also you kind of zigged where everybody else zagged a little bit. Are you doing something similar here? Because you're needing to acquire, probably even more so than photographers or photo enthusiasts. I would imagine that the market is, at least current state, is pretty niche. So, what sorts of approaches are you kind of leveraging to kind of organically drum up interest for this?
Yeah, so I would say at this stage we're still figuring out what is the core product that this company is going to be about. We have something today that hundreds of people are using and paying for, which is awesome. But I don't think we consider ourselves as having product market fit. I think right now we see the next 6 to 12 months as being a lot of rapid experimentation, throwing things up, showing people things, and seeing how they respond. So at this point, we're not doing very much marketing or promotion at all because we want to feel really good about the product that we have. So in the future, I'm not sure what it will look like. I mean, one of the things that differentiates us today from other AI tools is that we've focused on narrative. A lot of the other tools are mostly focused on like ad copy, marketing copy, website copy. We have people using it for those things, but we've really focused kind of the angle of the product on narrative, whether that's prose, fiction, nonfiction, or screenwriting for people in Hollywood, that kind of thing. So that's definitely a differentiator. But who knows? I feel like the company could change a lot in the next 6 to 12 months.
So kind of along those lines, I mean, it sounds like you're open potentially to kind of branching beyond, fiction writing. I'd be curious to, having done a pretty deep dive and probably being more familiar with GPT-3 and potentially kind of, AI in general more than the typical person. How has it informed kind of what you think the future of AI looks like? Maybe it could be specifically as it relates to kind of more creative type of work, or even just kind of broader, white collar work. Like, it sure seems that idea of kind of like I don't remember who it was. I think it was the Sapiens author that talked the idea about like we're already sort of cyborgs in a way. We're augmented. This sure seems like a next step in that sort of evolution. Like, how do you think about this? And maybe what's the, you mentioned like with your science fiction about like, what's the non-dystopian version of it? You know what I mean? Because you seem pretty enthusiastic about it,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's an incredible accelerant to creativity. I think it's an enabling technology. And I think that anytime we've had technology that's made things easier, that's taken the grunt work away from humans, it's created more jobs, it's created more abstraction. And so you're like working at a higher and higher level. And those low level opportunities go away, but more high level opportunities come to be. So I think the same is probably true here. I think that eventually, for writing specifically, the role of the writer goes up a few levels and you become more like an editor. So for the things that you love to write, you're still going to write them word by word. You're going to wordsmith them. But for stuff that you're like, I don't want to write this love scene, I've just done a million of these or something. Now you've got a writer at your beck and call who can like do that version, the first draft for you, and can help flesh it out. And then you can direct it, you can modify it, you can massage it, whatever. And I think that's true in all creative fields. I think all white collar work will probably be a collaboration with AI. And in the future, that's going to be the skill set. Like, how do you craft the thing that you make in collaboration with an AI partner? Because it's very different. It's a different way of working. And I don't think the way it works today is the way it will necessarily work in 10 or 20 years. I think we're still figuring out those interfaces. But I think it's very clear that it's going to be a part of almost any creative work in the future.
What kinds of questions or thoughts have you either encountered or have you kind of formulated yourself? Like, because there's so many implications here in terms of like, I would imagine, for example, that one of the first questions that people ask you around this stuff is, can a computer actually write compelling fiction, on its own, for example? And I know that's not what the purpose of the product is right now, but I mean, it sounds like you envision a future in the not too distant future where it can write parts of it, certainly, and do it at a high level. Questions around, do people want to consume stuff that if they're aware that the computer wrote it? Like, there's just lots of not ethical questions necessarily, but like philosophical, existential kinds of questions. Like, what sorts of things have you been running into, either from other people or just as you and your partner, as you've been kind of processing this?
Yeah, no, it's a really good question. And I think it comes up a lot, especially when people first hear about Sudo. I think people fall into one of two camps. They're either really excited about like how this can like enhance their work, or they're really afraid that this is portending this very dark future where humans aren't in the loop anymore and machines are just doing all the writing. And I think I usually go back to my experience with photography. It used to be a time that the only way to get a photo of you, Sean, would be to hire a painter. A photo would be to hire a painter, and they'd spend several hours or days like painstakingly putting paint onto paper to make it look like you. Today, I can take something out of my pocket, press one button, and I have this perfect representation of you. And I am not an artist. I'm not a photo artist. There are photo artists today, and they still exist. It's not that, painters went away. It's not that art history went away. It's just that it like abstracted another level up. So to be a Dino Arbus or to be an Ansel Adams or to be any of these people, you need a higher level of skill than you needed before. And certainly with camera phones, like, photos are everywhere now, just as in the future, writing may be everywhere. And our level of appreciation of the skill has gone up. Like, we can understand what makes a good photo good in a way we couldn't 10 years ago. Which is all a long way of saying, yes, possibly in the future, an AI could spin out a bunch of random stories, just like a million monkeys at a typewriter could pump out a million stories. And they'll probably not be very meaningful without a human in the loop, guiding them and driving them and trying to imagine what they should be about.
Yeah. I mean, it seems like it could, the areas where it seems like it would be very difficult are, things like, like the things that you bake into your products, for example, right? Like humor. There are aspects of things of writing, where you're trying to tap into an emotion, or you're inferring something that requires kind of 2 or 3 sort of logical steps to kind of make that connection. Those seem like areas that, at least in the short term / medium term, probably would be difficult for it to accomplish, right? But it sounds like you feel like it'll get pretty good at narrative construction, flow, chains of events, like all that kind of stuff.
I think at some point it will get better, yeah. And I think it's hard to know if it'll ever get to the point where we'll prefer to read something written by a computer or human. I think it's probably unlikely that it'll get to a point where you'll always be reading computer stuff, because I think the more there is of a specific type of thing, the less valuable it becomes. And so then if you have kind of the bespoke version written by humans or guided by humans, you're going to prefer it because it's rare, it's more interesting, it's more unique. But will it be able to create a story that someday like makes logical sense? Probably.
Yeah. Wow. That's crazy. That's exciting. Want to respect your time. I was curious though, you mentioned kind of reading science fiction and how it was, you didn't like how dystopian it was. And, that informed kind of how you approached writing. It certainly informs, I think, how you approach, like your products are fun and happy to use. And I think that I have to think that people come away feeling, even if subconsciously, like a little bit better about themselves. How do you think about kind of the state of, tech right now? Like, you're sort of in the tech world. Obviously you're very embedded from an AI perspective. And I know that your network is very tech heavy and all of that kind of stuff. There's a lot of, I think, to your point, maybe for similar reasons, like some negativity around like the future of things. How do you advise people to see the good? What is the good that you see? What are you maybe excited or optimistic about? And then how do you convince people to shed that sort of negative lens that they kind of maybe have subconsciously sort of acquired over the years?
Yeah. So I think if you go back like 10 or 20 years, tech is the underdog and tech is exciting and tech is like making all this cool stuff that we get to use for free. And if you fast forward to today, tech is this evil monster that's consuming the world, is making it more homogenous, less personal, less fair, less equitable, all these things. And I don't think there's anything unique about technology. I think that's technology is a representation of us. Any industry that's been a big industry in the years of our species has had periods where it was the underdog and it was exciting, and then it became big and it became evil, or at least perceived as evil.
Yeah.
So how do we see it as good? There's obviously people still creating really wonderful things using technology. We're all using technology today. Anything that we're doing is using technology, probably.
Mm-hmm.
So it's just a choice. Like, it's just, I don't think there's any magic to it. I think we can see the things that we love about this world that technology has enabled, or we can see the things that are terrible at the world that technology has enabled. So we can make that choice each day. We don't have to ignore either one. We can see them both too.
How do you, with that in mind, how do you think about, like, it sure seems like the whole Web3 community, depending on who you ask, I mean, has a lot of the similar kind of seeds of things that were present 20 years ago. People are just trying stuff. A lot of it looks super weird, even from like a UI perspective. There is a high degree, there's a lot of skepticism, but there's also a very high degree of optimism. How do you, I mean, is that, I don't know if you've been tinkering at all or exposing yourself to what degree into that world or not, but it sure seems like it fits your ethos, or at least parts of it fit your ethos.
What do I think about it? Yeah, I feel like, I honestly don't think I've dabbled enough in it to have an opinion yet. But I think that whenever you see people who are very creative and very smart getting excited about something, there's probably something there. So I think I'm skeptical about the skepticism, to be honest. Like, I don't fully understand all of this stuff, and I feel like I'm not entrenched enough to have an opinion about it. But just knowing the people that I am friends with who are excited about it, I trust that there's something there, and I'm excited to see what comes from it. Yeah,
very cool. Well, man, this was fantastic. For folks that want to learn more about Sudo, where should we send them?
You should send them to sudowrite.com, SUDOWRITE.com.
Awesome. Well, like I said, it's been far too long. It was fantastic to be able to chat with you and kind of catch up and hear how things are going. Super excited to kind of see where you take things. It's made me, I just playing around with the product kind of made me want to write more again. So, I mean,
awesome.
I want to see if I can try to figure out how to leverage it with the types of stuff that I create. But
that's great.
Yeah, it's super exciting, man. It's super exciting. Congrats on the progress so far, and best of luck.
Thanks so much, Sean. Great to talk.
Yeah.